The Veil did not explore space the way humans would later imagine explorers explored anything. They did not send ships bristling with instruments, hungry-eyed crews pressing their faces against viewport glass, hearts hammering with the particular electricity of the unknown. They did not name things after themselves or plant flags or carve their symbols into rock faces on worlds that had never asked to be documented. The Veil mapped silence. This was not a metaphor, though it would take humanity's linguists nearly 4 decades to understand that. When the Veil said they were cartographers of silence, they meant it with a precision that bordered on sacred geometry. Space, to the Veil, was not a vacuum punctuated by matter. It was a continuous field of resonance, a vast, living acoustic body, and the absence of resonance, the places where that field went perfectly, absolutely still, was what they tracked, catalogued, and treated with the same reverence a human surgeon might treat an unexplained hole in a chest X-ray. Silence meant something had absorbed the resonance. Silence meant something was there. Senior cartographer Iselvan of the Third Tidal Harmonic had been mapping the outer spiral boundary of what her people called the unspoken reach for 11 years. Her body, long, segmented, each of her 6 limbs capable of independent sensory function, was draped across the resonance console in the particular posture her culture called vrethel, a word that had no human translation but approximated something between meditative vigilance and the feeling of listening to a story you know will end badly. She had been in vrethel for 6 hours. The silence she was tracking had moved. That was impossible. Silence did not move. Silence was, by definition, the characteristic of a location, not an entity. A silence that relocated itself was a contradiction in the very framework of Veil cartographic science. It was the equivalent of a human mathematician watching the number 3 spontaneously become a 7. Iselvan's secondary limbs, the ones she used for fine instrument work, trembled. Not from fear. From the particular neurological response her species experienced when their worldview developed a crack. She recalibrated. The silence had moved again. She pulled up the resonance field from 6 hours ago and overlaid it on the current reading. The comparison was unambiguous. The zone of absolute acoustic stillness, a region roughly 400 kilometers in diameter, had traveled approximately 9 million kilometers in the direction of the inner systems. Not drifted. Not expanded. Traveled. With the purposeful, consistent velocity of something that knew where it was going. Iselvan unfolded herself from the console and crossed the mapping chamber in 4 long strides. She pressed her primary sensory cluster, what humans would later call her face, though the analogy was imperfect, against the direct resonance membrane, bypassing the instruments entirely and listening with her own body. The silence hit her like a physical thing. But it wasn't just silence. Inside the silence, beneath it, threaded through its absolute stillness like wire through stone, was something she had no name for. A subresonance. A pattern. Not the random acoustic scatter of dead matter, not the organic hum of a stellar body. Something structured. Something that repeated and varied and repeated again in a way that felt, and she would spend years trying to find a better word for this feeling and never succeed. Intentional. She pulled back from the membrane. Her senior assistant, a young Veil named Thesivor, who had only been out of his resonance apprenticeship for 2 seasons, was watching her from the corridor doorway with all 6 limbs held in the posture of professional concern. "Senior cartographer," he said. "What is it?" Iselvan looked at her readings one more time. Then she looked at Thesivor. Then she said something that would later be recorded as the first official Veil documentation of humanity's existence in all of their archival history. She said, "Get me the council frequency. Not the regional council. The convergence council. The full assembly." Thesivor's limbs shifted to the posture of alarm. "All 7 branches?" "All 7 branches," Iselvan confirmed. "And Thesivor."
She paused.
"Tell them I am not reporting a stellar anomaly. Tell them I am reporting a behavior." The word she used, Thelvrin, had no direct human translation either, but it meant specifically the behavior of a mind operating at scale. The behavior of something that thought. The behavior of something that moved through space, not because physics required it, but because it had decided to. Thesivor left at a run. Iselvan turned back to her resonance console and watched the silence move, steady and purposeful and absolutely sure of its direction, toward the warm, noisy, resonance-drenched inner systems where the Vale's oldest colonies hummed with the particular acoustic signature of several billion lives being lived. She was not afraid. She told herself this several times. She was a senior cartographer of the third tidal harmonic. She had mapped dead stars and resonance voids and the acoustic scars left behind by the collapse of planetary bodies. She had listened to the last dying vibration of a moon and felt nothing but professional satisfaction at a well-documented event. She was not afraid. The silence moved another 9 million kilometers toward home. Iselvan's secondary limbs resumed their trembling. The Convergence Council of the Vale did not meet in a room. This was a source of considerable confusion for the first human diplomats who tried to understand Vale governance, because the concept of a governing body implied, at least in human intuition, a body, a physical assembly, a chamber, a table around which entities gathered and argued, and eventually voted or deferred or compromised. The human brain was, at a fundamental level, a social instrument calibrated to rooms, to the specific geometry of faces arranged around a shared space. The Vale Council existed in the resonance field itself. Each of the 7 branch representatives maintained what the Vale called a vrethal node, a dedicated personal resonance signature, tuned to a precise frequency that could be broadcast across interstellar distances with only minimal degradation. When the council convened, they did not travel. They broadcast. 7 distinct resonance signatures, interweaving in real time, creating a temporary composite acoustic structure that functioned as a shared cognitive space. It was, in effect, a meeting that existed as music. Senior Resonance Keeper Mhallarvayan, who represented the first harmonic branch and was, by virtue of seniority, the closest thing the Vale had to a council chair, received Iselvan's emergency transmission at the equivalent of 3 in the morning in his local time cycle. He spent 4 minutes verifying the transmission's authentication codes, not because he doubted Iselvan's identity, but because an emergency summons to the full Convergence Council was, in the entire recorded history of the Vale, an event that had happened exactly 6 times, and every one of those 6 times had involved a category of crisis that permanently altered the course of Vale civilization. He spent the next 2 minutes in a posture his culture called frethal, the physical arrangement of the body that preceded an action you could not undo. Then, he broadcast the summons. 6 other resonance keepers woke up. By the time Iselvan had transmitted her full data package, the resonance readings, the movement calculations, the acoustic analysis of the pattern she'd detected beneath the silence, all 7 branch representatives were present in the composite field, their signatures weaving around each other with the particular tension of a structure under strain. "Walk us through the readings," said Mhallarvayan. Iselvan walked them through the readings. The silence, the movement, the subresonance pattern, the consistency of the velocity, the direction. When she finished, there was what would have been, in a human meeting, a silence of the profound and uncomfortable variety. In the Vale resonance meeting, it manifested as all 7 signatures simultaneously dampening to near imperceptibility, a collective acoustic intake of breath. "You are saying," said Councillor Viethrelane of the 5th branch, whose resonance signature carried the particular harmonic overtones of deep skepticism, "that this is a vessel." "I am saying this is a behavior," Iselvan said carefully. "The behavior is consistent with a vessel. It is also consistent with a creature of extraordinary scale. It is also consistent with a class of phenomenon for which we have no existing category." "Your analysis of the subresonance pattern," said Councillor Orvaneseth of the 2nd branch. "You described it as intentional. Explain that characterization." "The pattern repeats at a base interval. Within that repetition it varies. The variation is not random. It is not the stochastic variation of natural resonance processes. It follows a logic. The logic is not one I recognize, but it is internally consistent. Something is generating that pattern deliberately." "Communication?" said Mhallarvayan. "Possibly. Or navigation. Or both. Or something we do not have a concept for yet." There was another collective dampening. Then Councillor Vrethisovan of the 7th branch, the oldest member of the council, and the one whose resonance signature had, over decades of use, developed a quality the other counselors privately described as the sound of something that has already accepted the worst case, spoke.
Size, she said simply.
Iselvin understood the question. The zone of acoustic displacement suggests a physical object or collection of objects occupying approximately 400 kilometers of volume. That figure has remained consistent over the observation period, which suggests a single coherent structure rather than a dispersed field. The dampening this time was not brief. 400 kilometers. The largest Vale vessel ever constructed was 31 kilometers from bow to stern. It was called the Resonance of the Long Tide, and it had taken 4 generations to build, and was considered one of the supreme achievements of Vale civilization. 31 kilometers. The object of Iselvin's readings was 400 kilometers in diameter. Not length, diameter. It is moving toward the Tethervale colonies, said Councillor Viethrelane. It was not a question. At its current heading and velocity, it will reach the outer boundary of the Tethervale system in approximately 40 standard rotations. Has it shown any deviation in course? None. Any response to our standard resonance broadcasts? We have been broadcasting navigational harmonics on the open frequencies for 600 years. If it passed through range, the silence absorbs our broadcasts, Iselvin said. Our navigational harmonics would enter that zone and simply stop. Whether anything inside is receiving them and choosing not to respond, or whether they are genuinely not receiving them, I cannot determine. Mahallervayan's resonance signature shifted into the particular configuration the other counselors had learned over many years to associate with the decision being made at depth. A structural settling, the sound of a mind that had identified all available paths and chosen one. We send an approach vessel, he said. Single ship. 3rd harmonic configuration. Maximum resonance output. Full identification broadcast. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. We position ourselves in its path and we broadcast everything. Our resonance signature. Our history. Our greeting harmonics. Everything we would want a new presence to know about us, we make loud. And if it does not stop, asked Councillor Orvaneseth, then we learn something important about its intentions. And if it stops, but does not respond in any recognizable way? Mahallervayan's signature settled deeper. Then we learn something important about the limits of what we know. And if, began Vrethosovan. I know what you are going to ask, said Mahallervayan quietly. And I don't have an answer. I don't think any of us do. I think that's why we have to go find out. Vrethosovan's signature, the one that sounded like something that had already accepted the worst case, did something unexpected then. It brightened. Slightly. The way an old light brightens when it's been left on so long that brightening is its way of going out. Send Iselvin, she said. She found it. She should be the one who meets it. No one argued. Iselvin, listening to this from the edge of the composite field, felt the particular neurological response of Vrethel settle over her entire body like a change in atmospheric pressure. She would be the one who met it. She began preparing her vessel. The ISV Meridian Compact was not, technically speaking, a warship. This was a distinction that mattered enormously to the people who had built it, funded it, crewed it, and named it, and a distinction that mattered not at all to anyone who looked at it. It was 900 meters long. The designation Titan class referred to the new generation of integrated sovereignty vessels that the Earth Interstellar Authority had been commissioning over the previous 12 years, each one a self-contained administrative, scientific, military, and diplomatic entity capable of operating autonomously for up to 40 years without resupply. The Titan-class ships were not weapons platforms. They were civilization platforms. They carried hospitals and schools and courts of law and agricultural systems and manufacturing capacity and archives containing the full collected knowledge of human civilization as of their commissioning date. They carried weapons too, because the humans who built them had not yet encountered anything in interstellar space that required weapons but were constitutionally incapable of going anywhere significant without packing them anyway, the way a careful person always takes an umbrella when the sky looks uncertain. The Meridian Compact carried 14,000 people. It also carried, in its deepest structural core, a resonance dampener, a piece of technology that had been developed not for military purposes, but for navigational ones. 17 years of deep space travel had taught Earth's engineers that the electromagnetic wake of a vessel moving at significant fractions of light speed created interference patterns that played havoc with every sensor system the ship carried. The solution had been to generate a controlled null field, a zone of suppressed electromagnetic and acoustic output, around the ship's hull. Inside the null field, the ship's own sensors worked with perfect clarity. Outside the null field, the ship was, in terms of every form of electromagnetic emission, a hole in space. The Veil, who perceived the universe through resonance, experienced this as a zone of absolute silence. The humans inside the Meridian Compact experienced it as a Tuesday. Commander Sarah Yun was 43 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, had a civilian background in xenobiological architecture. She had designed habitation structures for environments that humans had never physically inhabited before designing them, which required a particular quality of mind she described as building for what you don't know, and had been chosen to command the Meridian Compact specifically because the Earth Interstellar Authority had, after 17 years of deep space operations, developed strong institutional opinions about what kind of person should be in charge when something unprecedented happened. They wanted someone who didn't panic. More specifically, they wanted someone who, when faced with the unprecedented, did not reach immediately for the nearest familiar framework and try to force the new thing into its shape. They had learned, expensively, that commanders who responded to the unknown with aggressive pattern matching made decisions that were fast and coherent and frequently catastrophic. Sarah Yun responded to the unknown by asking what it was before deciding what to do about it. This had made her moderately unpopular with a section of the Earth Interstellar Authority that valued decisiveness, and considerably popular with the section that valued accuracy. She was at her planning table, 3 weeks into the 40-day transit from the Kepler outpost toward the Proxima Development Corridor, reviewing xenobiological survey data from 3 systems they'd passed through, when her senior sensor analyst, a compact and precise man named Marcus Tubb, knocked on her door frame and then stood in it with the specific physical stillness of someone who has information they are not yet certain how to classify. "Marcus," she said, without looking up. "Commander, we have a contact." Yun looked up. She had a quality, observable in the moment of looking up from work, of absolute attentional transfer. When she redirected her focus, she didn't half redirect it. She left the previous thing entirely. "Define contact. Vessel, Commander." With high confidence. Approximate size reading is producing some equipment argument, but the median estimate is. Marcus paused in the specific way someone pauses when a number sounds implausible regardless of how many times they have already verified it. Roughly 4 kilometers. 4 kilometers. "Yes, Commander." Yun set down her data reader. Equipment argument meaning what? Meaning the lower end of the estimates is 3.2 kilometers and the upper end is 4.9. Everything agrees it is in that range. Everything also agrees it is a single coherent structure. Yun was quiet for a moment. "Then, where?" "Directly in our path. It appears to be stationary. It appeared on our sensors 17 minutes ago. We don't have data from earlier. I've checked the backlog and it simply wasn't there before." "It appeared." "Yes, Commander. At a range of approximately 40 million kilometers. It is broadcasting." This was the moment in Sarah Yun's life that she would later describe, in the memoir she wrote 20 years afterward, as the moment the universe changed shape. Not because she immediately understood what the broadcasting meant, but because she understood, at a physiological level below language, that the combination stationary directly in their path, broadcasting was not the behavior of debris, or natural phenomenon, or system malfunction. It was the behavior of something that had placed itself where it could be seen, and was now making noise. It was the behavior of something that was waiting. "Get me everything you can on that broadcast," she said. "And get Dr. Parada to the communication center." Dr. Ion Parada was the Meridian Compact's xenolinguistics specialist. He had a background in mathematical communication theory, a secondary specialty in biosemiotic systems, and a personal philosophy best summarized as all languages are attempts to solve the same problem, which is that minds are closed boxes, and everyone is always trying to pass a note through the wall. He was also, by common consensus of everyone on the ship, the most unflappable person aboard, not because he lacked emotion but because his emotional responses had been, Over decades of theoretical preparation for precisely this kind of moment, thoroughly channeled into a form that looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from professional calm. He was in the communication center in 4 minutes. He looked at the broadcast data for 30 seconds. Then he looked at Yun with an expression she had seen on exactly one other occasion, when she had been 12 years old and her mother had come home from the hospital with news that permanently rearranged the architecture of their family. "Commander," he said, "I need more data and more time. But I want to say before I have either that I believe this is structured. I believe it is patterned. And I believe whatever is out there put it directly in our path on purpose." Yun looked at the broadcast waveform on the display. It looked, to her untrained eye, like the kind of visual noise a system produced when something had gone wrong. But she was not a communication theorist, and she had hired Ione Parada precisely because she knew her own limits.
"Keep working," she said.
"I'm going to slow our approach to 1/8 transit speed. That gives us more time with it before we close range." She turned to Marcus. "Get me a full structural analysis on that vessel. I want to know everything we can determine about it from sensor data alone." "Yes, Commander." "And Marcus." He paused at the door. "Don't speculate to the general crew yet. I'll address the ship in 2 hours. For now, limit information to department heads." Marcus left. Yun turned back to the display and looked at the 4-kilometer vessel sitting in her path like a question. She had spent her career designing structures for environments that humans had never seen. She had always begun that process the same way, not by imagining what humans would need, but by trying to understand what the environment itself was. She started with the environment. She looked at the broadcast waveform. She listened. Ione Parada did not sleep for 31 hours. This was not unusual for him when he was working. What was unusual was that over those 31 hours he passed through a complete emotional arc, from disciplined professional excitement, through something that resembled despair, through a quality of stillness he had only previously experienced once, during a week-long silent meditation retreat he had attended at the age of 28 and never repeated, and emerged on the other side of that arc into a state he had no accurate label for but which felt, physiologically, like being very deeply awake. The broadcast was unlike any communication signal in human theoretical literature. It was not electromagnetic in the conventional sense. Or rather, it was electromagnetic, but it used the electromagnetic spectrum the way an instrument used air, as a medium through which to propagate something else. The something else was acoustic in structure, wave-based, patterned in both frequency and amplitude, with a recursive quality that reminded Parada, in his more fanciful moments during those 31 hours, of someone telling a story in which the story itself was the vocabulary. He built a basic analytical framework in the first 12 hours. In the next 8, he used it to identify what he was calling base units, recurring structural elements, appearing consistently enough to suggest either a lexical function or something analogous to one. He found 43 of them in the first pass. By hour 20, he had 67. By hour 31 he had, with growing certainty, 91, and he was beginning to see, not understand, but see, which was its own specific and significant step, the relational logic that connected them. It wasn't a language in the human sense. It wasn't a set of symbols representing concepts. It was more like, and he wrote this in his analysis log with the awareness that it was inadequate, but also that inadequate was sometimes the best you could do at the frontier, a field grammar. A system of relationships between states. The meaning wasn't in any single unit. It was in the pattern of transitions between units, in the way the field moved. It was a language that existed in motion. He thought about that for a long time. Then he wrote in his log, "This species may perceive reality not as a collection of objects in space, but as a collection of states in transition. If so, their fundamental ontological category is not thing but change. Every noun is a verb. Every object is an event." He sat back and looked at that sentence. Then he wrote below it, "This may be the most important sentence I have ever written. It may also be completely wrong. Proceed accordingly." He brought his preliminary findings to Commander Yun at hour 32. She read the full report, which took her 40 minutes, and then sat quietly for a while in the way she sat quietly when she was thinking rather than when she was uncertain, and Parada had been on this ship long enough to know the difference. "Can we respond?" she asked finally. "We can broadcast." Whether they will receive it in a way that is meaningful to them depends on factors I don't yet understand. What would you broadcast? Mathematically? That's the instinct, prime numbers, geometric progressions, the standard first contact sequence. But, Commander, I don't think that's right for this species, based on what I'm reading. Parada paused. If their language is about states in transition, about change rather than fixed objects, then a list of static symbols may not translate as a greeting. It may translate as a list, which is a different thing. Yun looked at him steadily. What would translate as a greeting? A gesture of approach. Something that moves in a way that is governed by intention rather than physics. Something that says, I am changing my state in relation to you, deliberately, and I am showing you the deliberateness. Yun was quiet for another long moment. We've been decelerating for 31 hours, she said. From 1/8 transit speed. That deceleration is in our electromagnetic wake. Is it in the resonance data? Parada stared at her. The deceleration, she said carefully, is a change. It is a state in transition. We are a very large object that has been moving at consistent velocity and then changed that velocity in relation to the position of their vessel. If their language is about change rather than objects, then we have already been saying something, Parada finished. He was on his feet. And what we've been saying is, we see you, and we are, Commander, I need to get back to the data. Go. He went. He returned 8 hours later looking like a man who had walked through a significant interior weather system and found something on the other side. The deceleration pattern, he said without preamble. They've been responding to it. There are changes in their broadcast over the last 40 hours that correlate. I can't say respond with certainty, but the correlation is not accidental with our deceleration profile. Specifically, when our deceleration rate held steady, their broadcast held its base pattern. When we changed our deceleration rate, even slightly, their broadcast shifted.
He paused.
They are tracking our motion with extraordinary precision, Commander. And I believe they are using changes in their broadcast to mirror back their perception of our changes in state. They're telling us what they see us doing. As best I can interpret it, yes. Yun leaned back in her chair. Outside the viewport, though it was a processed visual, constructed from sensor data rather than direct observation, because direct optical viewing at this range was uninformative, the 4-kilometer shape of what she was increasingly thinking of simply as the ship hung in space with the particular stillness of something that had chosen to be still. They know we're here, she said. They knew before we knew they were there, said Parada. I think the deceleration, our deceleration, is what caused them to stop and position themselves in our path. I think they were tracking us before we had any sensor data on them. Yun processed this. They track motion, she said slowly. Not objects. Motion. The meridian compact inside its null field is invisible to them. But when we decelerate, the field itself shifts, changes geometry around the hull. The silence changed shape, Parada said. The motion of the silence. They tracked the motion of the silence. He shook his head with a kind of awe that was not performance. Commander, they don't see the ship. They see what the ship does to the space around it. They see our effect. There was a quality of quiet in the room after that sentence that felt different from the quiet that had preceded it. Can we talk to them? Yun asked. I don't know yet. I need to understand the field grammar better before I can construct anything intentional. But I think he hesitated. I think they're already trying to talk to us. I think they have been since they first detected us. And I think what they have been saying at the most fundamental level is, we know you are there. We know you are changing. We are changing too.
Look.
Yun looked at the processed visual of the alien vessel. Then let's look, she said. Iselvin's vessel, the resonance research ship voice of the attending tide, was 31 days out from the Vale cartographic station and 5 hours from what she had calculated as optimal communication range when she accepted the incoming transmission from the Convergence Council. It was Mhallervayan. His resonance signature had the quality of someone who had not been sleeping well. Progress report, he said. The entity has decelerated, Iselvin said. Significantly. The deceleration began approximately 40 hours ago and continues. It is also not linear. The rate changes at irregular intervals. You have analyzed the deceleration pattern? Extensively. Iselvin's secondary limbs moved in the motion her species used to express something close to what humans would call reluctance to be certain about something they were actually quite certain about. Mahalarvayan Sr. The deceleration is patterned. The irregular rate changes are not mechanical. They are not the profile of a vessel managing momentum or fuel efficiency. The changes correspond. I have run this analysis many times and the correlation holds to changes in my own broadcast. Silence on the council frequency. Explain, said Mahalarvayan. When I shift my broadcast into a new harmonic sequence, the entity, approximately 11 hours later, which is consistent with a one-way communication delay of 11 light hours at its current position, changes its deceleration rate. When I hold my broadcast steady, its deceleration rate holds steady. When I create an irregular pattern in my broadcast, the deceleration rate produces an irregular pattern in response. She paused. They are listening to me, and they are answering in the only language they have found so far that I can hear. Another silence. Longer. They found a way to speak into silence, said Mahalarvayan. They have made their motion into a message, Iselvin said. Which means they understand, at least intuitively, that motion is how we perceive. They may not understand why, they may not know our biology or our sensory architecture. But they have understood that the way we are listening requires something to move, and they have made themselves move in response.
She paused again.
Mahalarvayan Sr. Whatever is in that vessel, whatever kind of mind operates it, it is paying attention. What are you going to do? Iselvin looked at her resonance displays. The great moving silence, now so much closer that the subresonance pattern, that structured, intentional, endlessly varied pattern, was rich and complex in her instruments, like music heard from the next room suddenly becoming music heard from the same room. I am going to stop, she said. I am going to hold my position and hold my broadcast at a single steady frequency. And then I am going to wait and see if they have learned enough from our exchange to say something more. And if they don't, then I will try something else. She arranged her limbs in Vrethel. I have been listening to the subresonance pattern inside the silence for 31 days, Mahalarvayan Sr. I have not decoded it, but I have found something in it. She hesitated. It has emotion. A very long silence. Explain that characterization, said Mahalarvayan, in the tone of someone who is not sure they wanted the explanation. Resonance patterns in biological systems carry what I can only describe as emotional harmonics, Iselvin said. The quality of a living system's resonance changes with its internal state. We know this from our own biology, from the biology of every creature we have studied. The subresonance pattern inside that silence, the intentional pattern, has qualities consistent with a high arousal internal state. Elevated, active, varied. The quality of something that is thinking hard and feeling strongly about what it is thinking. You are saying the vessel's crew is emotionally engaged with this encounter. I am saying the vessel's crew is not calm. They are intensely alert. They are. Iselvin paused one final time. They are the way I feel right now, Mahalarvayan Sr. They are exactly the way I feel right now. She closed the council channel. She held her position. She waited. Ion Parada constructed humanity's first intentional message to an alien intelligence over the course of 18 hours, using 3 white bards, 2 tablets, and what his colleague Dr. Kemi Adewale, the Meridian Compact's senior acoustics engineer, would later describe as an increasingly alarming quantity of tea. He abandoned the standard first-contact mathematical framework on the 4th hour and spent an hour sitting on the floor of the communications center not looking at anything in particular, which Dr. Adewale recognized as a signal that he was doing some of his best work. The problem, as Parada understood it, was this. Every first-contact framework in human history had been designed around the assumption that the other party perceived reality in a fundamentally similar way to humans. Objects in space. Locations. Fixed coordinates. The language of geometry and mathematics. But the beings out there didn't perceive objects. They perceived motion.
Change.
The transitions between states. You couldn't say, here I am in their language, because here wasn't a concept that translated. Location was not a primary category for them. Position only existed in relation to movement. You couldn't say I am a mind because the bounded, located, fixed position self, might not exist for them either. If everything was change, then identity might not be a stable location, but a consistent pattern of change, a characteristic way of moving. So the message couldn't be here is what we are. It had to be here is how we move. And the emotion piece. Parada had been turning that over since hour one. Because if the acoustic analysis was right, if the alien broadcast carried emotional harmonic content, then the analytical content of the message mattered, but so did its texture, its quality of feeling. You could not send a message that said in motion language, "We are approaching peacefully," while the underlying resonance pattern of the broadcast carried frequencies consistent with aggressive high-stress arousal. You had to mean it. He thought about this for a long time. Then he went and found Commander Yun. She was in her office, reading. She looked up with that quality of total attentional transfer. "I need something from you," Parada said. "And it's going to sound strange. It already sounds strange. Go ahead. I think the message we send has to carry emotional content, not just information. And I think that means it has to be generated by someone who is genuinely feeling the right things."
He paused.
"I could engineer a signal that carries the correct frequencies. I could synthesize it technically. But I don't think it would hold. I don't think the texture would be right. A synthesized signal would be like a recording of laughter. The frequencies would be correct, and it would be emotionally unconvincing." Yun was very still. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that whoever generates the primary broadcast needs to actually be in the relevant emotional state while they generate it. And the emotional state I think is most likely to translate correctly, based on everything I've decoded about this species' acoustic emotional register, is not calm and not aggressive. He's searched for it. It's the feeling of encountering something that exceeds your current understanding and responding to that with openness instead of fear. The feeling of being at the edge of what you know and choosing to keep going anyway." Yun looked at him for a long time. "You want me," she said. "You're the one I've seen do it," said Parada quietly. "Every time we enter a new system, every time the data doesn't match the predictions, every time the situation outpaces the protocol, you do something I don't have a word for. You get more present. Not less. Most people contract when the unknown appears. You expand." A silence. "That's a generous characterization," Yun said. "It's an accurate characterization. I've been watching for 3 years." Another silence. Then Yun stood. "Show me what I have to do," she said. What she had to do, as it turned out, was stand in the center of the resonance transmission array, a room-sized instrument that Dr. Adewale had spent 12 hours reconfiguring to broadcast in acoustic resonance frequencies rather than electromagnetic, and speak. Not in words. In the modulation of breath and vocalization that Parada had determined, from his analysis of the alien broadcast, was the closest analog to the emotional register he was trying to match. Long, sustained tones varied in frequency and amplitude according to a score he had written on a whiteboard, but varied also, and this was the part that could not be engineered, by whatever Sarah Yun was actually feeling in the moment. She stood in the center of the room. She thought about what she was doing. She thought about 14,000 people on this ship, and the alien vessel 4 light hours away, and the 31 years she had spent building things for environments she had never been in, and the quality of attention she had felt since the moment Marcus Tebb had appeared in her doorway with information he didn't know how to classify. She thought about openness. She broadcast. The signal traveled at the speed of light. The signal arrived 11 hours and 14 minutes after the voice of the attending tide went silent and still. Iselvin had spent those 11 hours in Vrethel, the deep meditative receptivity posture, not because she had planned to, but because the depth of her attention to the silence required it. She was listening with her whole body, waiting for the silence to change. When it changed, she was ready. The change was subtle at first. The outer edge of the null field shifted, not its overall shape, but its surface texture, the fine acoustic structure of the boundary between the zone of silence and the surrounding resonance field. Iselvin's instruments caught it before her body did, but only by seconds. Then the subresonance pattern intensified, not in volume, in clarity, as if something that had been present all along had finally been turned toward her directly, had oriented itself, the way a creature turns its sensory cluster toward a sound. And then she heard it. It was not a language. It was not a message in any sense she had a framework for. It was, in the precise technical vocabulary of Veil resonance science, a broadcast of structured biological acoustic emission modulated by intentional emotional state, which was the scientific way of saying a living being had projected feeling into the resonance field. The feeling was, Iselvin sat with her body's response to it for a long time before she tried to put language to it. The feeling was reaching. It was the emotional quality of extension, of something that had a boundary, and was choosing to extend past it, not aggressively, not with the high-frequency charge of a territorial display or the tight regular pulse of a threat signal. It was the particular resonance quality she associated with, and here she sat with this comparison for a very long time, turning it over to make sure she wasn't constructing something she wanted to find. It was the resonance quality she associated with her own state of being during the most meaningful moments of her work. The moments when she was deepest in vrethal and a pattern emerged from what had seemed like acoustic noise. The moments when the universe showed her something she hadn't known to look for. She associated it with the resonance quality of genuine curiosity, not the sharp, targeted curiosity of a predator identifying prey. The open, sustained, exploratory curiosity of a mind that had found something that exceeded it and was choosing, actively, deliberately choosing, to meet that excess with receptivity rather than contraction. She sat with this for a long time. Then she did something that was not in the Council's mission protocols, not in the Veil's standard first contact procedures, which had been written in the abstract long ago by people who had not imagined this moment would actually arrive, and not something she had planned or consciously decided. She began to sing. Not in any formal resonance broadcast frequency. Not through her instruments. She allowed her own biological resonance, the particular acoustic signature of her body in a state of deep emotional activation, to express itself without mediation, and she allowed the transmission array on her vessel to pick up and amplify that expression, and she broadcast it directly at the silence. She broadcast the sound of being moved, of being, in this moment, changed. She broadcast the resonance quality of a mind encountering something that exceeded its frameworks and choosing, in that exceedance, to be grateful rather than afraid. The broadcast lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, she was in the posture her culture called vrethissel, the arrangement of limbs and body that meant, I have given something irreversible into the world. She waited for the next 11 hours. When the response came, Ion Parada had been at his station for 23 hours. He was so tired that the tiredness had passed through itself and become something resembling clarity. He heard the new signal the moment it arrived, and he sat very still for a long time before he said anything. Then he called Commander Yun. She picked up in 2 rings. Commander, said Parada. They answered. And it's not what I expected. A brief pause. What is it? Said Yun. Parada looked at the waveform on his display, at the extraordinary complexity of it, at the quality that he had spent 11 hours trying to quantify and had finally, inadequately labeled responsive grief. Not grief in the painful sense, but grief in the original sense, the sense of being altered by contact, of something that had been one shape becoming a different shape. I think, he said slowly, that they were afraid of us. I think they have been afraid of us since they first detected us. And I think what they just sent in response to your broadcast, is something that says, we were afraid and now we are not afraid and we are telling you this so you understand what you did. Another silence. What did I do? Said Yun. You made yourself vulnerable, said Parada. You broadcast genuine feeling instead of information. And I think for this species, that is the specific act that transforms an unknown entity from a threat into I don't have the word.
A known. A met.
A something you have exchanged genuine interiority with.
He paused.
Commander. I think they just told us they trust us. Mahalarvayan received Iselvin's message, the full data package from the singing, the response, the analysis, and spent 4 hours with it before he convened the council. He needed the 4 hours because he had to be honest with himself about what he was feeling, and what he was feeling was not what a senior resonance keeper and first branch counselor was supposed to feel when presented with first contact data. He was afraid. Not of the entity itself. Not of the Meridian Compact, whose slow, deliberate approach and whose extraordinary emotional broadcast had produced in him the same recognition as Elvin had described, the quality of genuine curiosity, of openness, of a mind choosing to expand rather than contract. He was not afraid of the minds in that vessel. He was afraid of what his own people would do with the information. When he convened the council and presented Zelvin's full report, the response was not uniform. It was not the frightened but united front he had hoped for. The 7 branches of the Convergence Council had been, for 200 years, in a state of managed tension, philosophical differences about expansion, about the rights of the outer colonies, about the relationship between the ancient homeworld harmonics and the new resonances being developed in the frontier systems. Those tensions had been managed for so long that the management had become invisible, like a structural element in a building so familiar that no one noticed it until it failed. The first contact data cracked the management. Councillor Viethrelane of the 5th branch spoke first and spoke for a long time, and what she said was, in essence, the entity is vast, it is approaching our colonies, and the fact that it has broadcast something we are interpreting as emotional openness does not mean it is not also, simultaneously, a 400-kilometer structure of unknown military capacity moving toward inhabited Veil space. Curiosity and conquest were not mutually exclusive. The history of the Veil's own colonial period, which Viethrelane invoked with the precision of someone who had been waiting for the right moment, demonstrated that a civilization could be genuinely fascinated by what it was also systematically absorbing. Councillor Orvaneseth of the 2nd branch countered, with equal precision, that the entity had decelerated voluntarily, that it had not deviated from peaceful approach behavior at any point, that the emotional broadcast was not the behavior of a civilization planning conquest. That conquest required suppression of internal emotional expression, the tight regular discipline of a military acoustic register, and the entity's broadcast was the opposite of that. It was exposed. It was the behavior of something that had decided to show its interior state rather than conceal it. Councillor Vrethisoven of the 7th branch said, in her aged, already accepted the worst-case register, that they were arguing about interpretation when they should be arguing about response. The entity would reach communication range in 9 days. Zelvin's analysis suggested the possibility of meaningful exchange. The question was not what the entity meant. The question was what the Veil would say back. And this was where the council fractured, because the 7 branches had very different answers to that question. The 5th branch wanted a formal boundary signal, a clear resonance marker indicating that the outer colonial systems were Veil territory and that approach without explicit authorization was prohibited. Diplomatic, but bounded. The 2nd branch wanted continued open exchange, build on what Zelvin had established, allow the encounter to develop organically, trust that the emotional resonance communication already established was more reliable than formal territorial marking. The 3rd branch, represented by Councillor Elveneth, young for the council, his harmonic signature carrying the particular overtones of someone who had grown up in the frontier systems and regarded the homeworld branches with a kind of affectionate impatience, wanted to broadcast everything. Full cultural resonance archive. Complete harmonic history of the Veil people. Let the entities see not just that the Veil were here, but who the Veil were. We have their emotional broadcast, Elveneth said. That individual, whatever they are, whatever biology they have, open themselves completely to us. They broadcast their interior state without protection. If we respond with a territorial boundary signal, we are saying, your openness was noted, and we are choosing not to reciprocate it. We are saying, you showed us your heart, and we showed you our fence. You are being romantic, said Viethrelane. I am being accurate, said Elveneth. You are assuming that what Zelvin interpreted as openness is what it was. You are assuming that Zelvin's emotional reading of a completely alien resonance pattern is reliable. I am trusting a senior cartographer of the 3rd tidal harmonic who has been listening to this entity for 31 days and whose analysis is the most rigorous work I have seen in 20 years of council service. Mahalarvan, who had been listening to this with the particular internal stillness of someone who already knew what they were going to do, but was waiting to see if anything would change his mind, felt nothing change. He spoke. We will not send a territorial boundary signal, he said. We will not broadcast our full cultural archive. We will do neither the thing that closes, nor the thing that opens completely. He paused. We will send Zelvin more time. We will extend her authorization to continue the exchange using her judgment, because her judgment is the judgment of someone who has actually been in this encounter, and the Council has not. We will give her 30 days, and we will listen to what she learns. And if the entity enters the colonial system boundary in those 30 days, said Viethrelane, then we will trust that Azelvan has built enough of a relationship to ask it to stop. And we will see if it does. Silence. That is a significant trust, said Viethrelane. Yes, said Mhalarvayan. It is. He paused. It is also what Azelvan would do in our position. And Azelvan is, currently, the only member of the civilization who actually knows anything about what is out there. He broadcasts the decision close harmonic, the resonance equivalent of a gavel. 30 days. Keep the frequency open. I want reports every 8 hours. The council dispersed. Mhalarvayan stayed in his broadcast node for a long time after. He thought about the emotional broadcast, about Azelvan's description of it, about the feeling of a mind encountering something that exceeded it and choosing openness. He thought, I wonder if they feel the same way we do. He thought, I wonder if that matters. He decided it did. With 15 days remaining in Parada's working timeline, the Meridian Compact and the voice of the attending tide were 11 million kilometers apart. This was, by deep space standards, the equivalent of standing in the same room. Commander Yun had called a full ship address at hour 53 after first contact. She had stood at the central broadcast podium, a physical podium which she almost never used because she felt that the physical presence of a speaker at a podium carried a quality of weight that ordinary ship-wide broadcasts did not, and she had told 14,000 people what was in their path. The response had been what she had expected, which was to say, everything. Fear, in various intensities and styles. Excitement, ditto. Philosophical reactions that ranged from profound spiritual wonder to aggressive dismissal. Practical concerns, are they going to attack us? What happens if this goes wrong? Who's in charge of the decision-making here? A brief surge of unrest in the civilian quarters that had been managed by the ship's community council before Yun's internal security team had needed to involve themselves, which she considered a good sign about the health of the community's self-organizing capacity. And then, gradually, something she hadn't anticipated, a collective settling. Not calm, not the absence of feeling. A settling into the reality of the situation. The particular emotional adaptation of people who had understood that something unprecedented had happened, that it was not stopping, and that the only available option was to be present for it. She had seen this in individuals before. She had not expected to see it at ship scale. She noted it in her log with the word remarkable and moved on. 15 days into the exchange, Parada had what he called a partial working grammar, not a complete translation framework, not the ability to construct arbitrary messages, but an understanding of the emotional resonance register that was robust enough to allow real-time modulation. He could, essentially, broadcast in the alien language well enough to communicate states and intentions, if not propositions. He could say, we are here. We are attending. We mean no harm. We are curious. We are open. He could increasingly say something more complex. We have something to share. We want to share it with care. We are aware of the asymmetry between us, the size of this vessel, the fact that we are the approaching party, and we want to demonstrate that we understand how that asymmetry might feel from where you are. This last category of message had taken him 6 days to construct. When he broadcast it, the response from the alien vessel came in 4 hours instead of 11, which told Yun, who had been watching the response time data with the attention she gave to any metric that changed, that the alien vessel had also been closing distance. They were both moving toward each other. The distance between them was also a kind of conversation. Yun spent a significant amount of time, during those 15 days, in her planning room with the processed visual display of the alien vessel. She studied everything the sensors could tell her about it. It was 4 kilometers from end to end. It was not the architecture of a warship in any configuration she recognized. It had no visible weapons arrays, no defensive plating geometry. Nothing that matched the forms her experience with human military design had taught her to read as aggressive intent. It looked, to her xenobiological architect's eye, like a research vessel. Something built for sustained presence in open space. Elegant, in the way that things built for a long relationship with their environment were elegant. She found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to see it. Really see it. Not the sensor-constructed visual. The actual object. She put in a request to Dr. Adewale to see if the null field could be temporarily modulated to allow optical observation. Dr. Adewale came back to her 6 hours later with a technical solution and the look of someone who had been doing the happiest engineering work of their life. "It'll take the field down for about 30 seconds, he said. "The alien vessel will see us. The whole us. 400 meters of hull." He had made an error. The ship was 900 meters, not 400, but Yun recognized the error as a symptom of excitement and let it pass. "Schedule it," she said. "Notify Dr. Parada. He should broadcast something to let them know it's coming, that it's deliberate, not mechanical failure." What should I tell him to say? Yun thought for a moment. Tell him to say, "Look. The null field dropped at 0600 ship time on day 16. Iselvin felt it like a sound appearing from inside silence. For 31 days of approach and 15 days of active exchange, the entity had been a presence she knew only through its effects, the shape of the silence it created, the patterns in the boundary of its null field, the resonance broadcasts she had received. She had built an understanding of it from these peripheral signals the way a Veil cartographer built a map of a region they couldn't enter directly, by attending to everything around the center until the center's shape revealed itself. And then the silence opened. And she heard the ship. 400 kilometers. No. She corrected herself almost immediately. That was her initial estimate, and she had revised it. The resonance signature of the object that had just become audible in the field was consistent with approximately 900 meters in length of living ship. Living because it was full of resonance. Full of the acoustic byproduct of 14,000 biological entities, their heartbeats and their breath and their voices and their movement. All of it contained and simultaneous and extraordinarily varied. It was the most complex single acoustic event Iselvin had ever experienced. It was also, in the precise technical vocabulary she had spent her career developing, and which failed her completely in this moment, beautiful. She listened to it for 30 seconds. 29 seconds longer than she would later record in her official log that the field had been open. She sat in Vrethel with her body's every sensor attuned to this thing she had been approaching for weeks, and she listened to the sound of 14,000 lives inside a vessel in the dark, and she felt something she recognized as a significant alteration of her internal state. Not fear, not excitement, not either of the things she had been most rigorously prepared for by years of theoretical first contact training, but something that she could only describe, in the personal log she kept, separate from the official record, as the feeling of recognizing something you did not know you had been looking for. The field closed. Silence returned. Iselvin sat for a long time. Then she sent a message to the Convergence Council that contained no analysis, no data, no protocol language. It contained a single resonance phrase from the Veil's oldest literary tradition, a phrase used in the context of meetings that permanently altered the state of the one who attended them. The phrase translated approximately as, "I have been changed by this. I am reporting the change." Mahallarvayan received it at the equivalent of very early morning and sat with it for a long time. Then he sent back the phrase the Veil used in response, which translated as, "We know. We are ready." On the Meridian Compact, Ion Parada had been at his station when the field dropped, and he had listened to the alien vessel's resonance broadcast, and he had spent the next 4 hours in a state that was not exactly work and not exactly not work, but something in between that he recognized as the particular productivity of someone whose categories have just undergone structural revision. What he heard in those 30 seconds was not the same thing as Iselvin heard. He heard it from the other side. He heard the alien vessel's resonance broadcast with the same instruments he used for all his analysis, and he heard it as data, and the data told him something he had been circling for weeks without landing on directly. The alien broadcast, during those 30 seconds, changed. Not in content, not in the base frequency, or the field grammar structure. It changed in quality, in what he had been calling emotional texture. And the quality it changed to was, he wrote in his analysis log, "For 30 seconds, when we dropped our null field, The alien vessel's broadcast shifted into a register I have not observed before in the dataset. I have been applying the label high arousal positive to this register, which is accurate but insufficient. The more accurate label, I now believe, is wonder. I believe they heard us. I believe they heard 14,000 humans alive inside the ship. And I believe that hearing us produced in them the same response this encounter has produced in me. He paused over his tablet. Then he wrote, I think this is what contact is. Not the exchange of information. Not the establishment of protocols. This. The moment two kinds of mind realize they are both in the presence of something that exceeds them. He saved the entry. He went to find Commander Yun. The day before the Meridian Compact reached what Parada had designated as Resonance Optimal Proximity Range, the distance at which the field grammar exchange could be conducted with sufficient resolution for complex communication, Commander Yun did something that was not in any protocol. She asked Ion Parada to teach her to listen, not to analyze, not to apply the framework he had built. To listen the way the aliens listened, attending to change rather than object, to transition rather than position, to the field rather than the fixed point. They spent 12 hours on it. Parada took her through everything he'd understood about the acoustic resonance perceptual model. Not as theory, as practice. He had her close her eyes and attend to the sounds in the communication center, not the individual sounds, not the equipment noise or the distant voices, but the way those sounds related to each other. The way they changed, the patterns that emerged from change. Yun was, unsurprisingly, very good at this. By hour 6 she was doing something Parada had not expected. She was describing things. Not things she was hearing, exactly. Things she was inferring from hearing. Relationships between acoustic events. Systems of change within change. After hour 8 she said, quietly, without opening her eyes, I think I understand why they perceive the null field as significant. To us it's silence. To them, silence is information. Silence means something chose to be still. And a silence that moves is a moving choice. An intention expressed as absence. Parada looked at her. They've been reading our character from our null field, she continued. Not our ship. Our null field. The shape of what we suppress. The way our silence moves. She opened her eyes. That's more revealing than anything we could have broadcast on purpose. Yes, said Parada. I believe so. What did our null field tell them about us? Parada thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. That we are contained, he said finally. That we generate a great deal and choose to hold most of it inward. That we have significant internal life that we do not typically project outward. And that when we do project, when the field opened, when you broadcast your emotional signal, it is a deliberate choice. Not a leak, a decision. He paused. I think to them, that combination, great internal richness held inward, expressed only by choice, may be legible as a kind of, I keep almost saying dignity, but that's a human category. Say it anyway, said Yun. Dignity, said Parada. I think they may perceive us as having dignity. Yun was quiet for a moment. And what do we perceive them as having? She asked. Parada thought. Courage, he said. The alien vessel is tiny relative to ours. It is one ship, alone, positioned in the path of an entity many times its size, broadcasting its emotional interior state with no guarantee of how that broadcast will be received. He paused. They put themselves in front of us and made themselves known before they knew what we were. That's not protocol. That's something more personal than protocol. Yun nodded slowly. When we arrive at proximity tomorrow, she said, I want to be in the communication center. Not watching. Present. Understood. And I own. He looked at her. What do we say? Parada had been preparing for this question for 3 weeks. He had built frameworks and drafted structures and revised them and thrown them out and started over. He had the analytical vocabulary now. He could construct a complex message. And yet, standing here, 12 hours from the most significant communicative event in human history, he found that all of his preparation distilled itself into something very simple. We say what's true, he said. We say, we are large, and we know it. We are powerful, and we know it. And we have come to you, Not the other way, because you placed yourself in our path and waited, and that act was significant, and we chose to honor it.
He paused.
And we say, we don't know what comes next. We don't know the rules of this. We've never done this before. Neither have you. And we think that not knowing the rules might be the best possible beginning. Yun looked at him. Can you say all of that in field grammar? She asked. I've been saying it for 3 weeks, said Parada. I've been saying it every time we broadcast. I've been saying it with every change in our approach velocity and every modulation in the resonance signal and every 30 seconds of open null field. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that arrived at the end of a long, sustained effort and feels different from any other kind of smile. I think they already know. Tomorrow we'll just say it louder. The voice of the attending tide and the ISV Meridian Compact achieved resonance optimal proximity at 0800 ship time. At that distance, Iselvin's instruments could resolve the subresonance pattern of the human vessel with extraordinary clarity. She could hear, could truly hear, with the full sensory richness of her species' remarkable acoustic perception, the ship as a system, the ship as a living community. The ship as something that breathed and moved and processed and felt and thought at the scale of 14,000 minds, all simultaneously, all different, all woven together into a single extraordinary acoustic structure. She had heard individual human broadcasts, the directed signals that Parada constructed, the emotional broadcasts that had changed her perception of this encounter. But hearing the ship directly at this range was different. It was the difference between reading a description of music and sitting inside a concert hall. She listened for a long time before she said anything. Then she broadcast. What she broadcast was not in the field grammar communication system she and Parada had been building. It was her own biological resonance, unmediated, full amplitude. It was Iselvin, in the totality of her present state, projected outward into the space between their vessels. And her present state was this. She had been afraid. She had made this approach carrying the full weight of her species' first contact anxiety, the Convergence Council's fractured response, the knowledge that the decisions made in these days would persist for centuries in both their histories. She had carried all of that, and she had stayed in Vrethel anyway, had maintained her receptivity and her care, and her professional commitment to accuracy and perception. And what she had perceived, over 46 days of approach and exchange, was something she had not been prepared for by any of her training or her theoretical study or her species' elaborate philosophical frameworks for thinking about the existence of other minds. She had perceived people, not humans. She had no framework for that category yet, though she would spend the rest of her life building one. Not allies or enemies or a civilization to be evaluated against the interests of the Veil. People, individuals, a community of minds, each distinct, collectively generating a resonance that was unlike anything she had ever heard and at the same time, in its deepest structural quality, recognizable. Not in content, not in the specific frequencies or patterns, in the underlying character of it, in the thing that all biological resonance had in common, regardless of the biology, regardless of the species, regardless of the chemistry or the substrate or the sensory architecture. The quality of mattering to oneself. The resonance of minds that cared about their own existence. That felt the significance of their own lives. That generated, by the simple fact of being alive and present and aware, an acoustic field that said, "We are here, and our being here is not nothing." She broadcast this. She broadcast the state of recognizing personhood. It was the most intimate thing she had ever projected into the resonance field. More intimate than the fear, more intimate than the wonder. This was the bedrock below both of those things. This was what she knew. On the Meridian Compact, Ion Parada heard the broadcast and went very still at his station. Commander Yun was standing beside him, as she had been for the past 4 hours, not watching and not performing watching, but genuinely present in the way she had been genuinely present for everything that had mattered on this ship in the 3 years he had known her. "What is she saying?" Yun asked quietly. Parda spent a long time with it. A long time that was not hesitation but the particular attentiveness of someone who wants to be accurate about something that matters. She's saying, He began and then stopped, and started again. She's saying she sees us, he said finally. She's saying that after all of this, the approach, the readings, the exchange, she sees us. Not as an entity, not as a power or a threat or an unknown variable. As people. He paused. She's saying that was what she was trying to find out. All of this, the broadcast, the singing, the 30 seconds of open field, she wasn't assessing our capabilities. She wasn't running threat calculations. She was trying to determine if we were people.
He stopped.
And, said Yun. And her conclusion is yes. Yun was quiet. Outside, at a distance that was, by the standards of space, almost no distance at all, the 4-kilometer Vale research vessel held its position in the resonance field and listened, and everything it heard said, yes. Yun turned to the transmission array. Let me respond, she said. Parada stepped aside. She stood in the center of the room. She felt the array's broadcast sensitivity adjust around her, the way it always did, calibrating to her particular resonance signature. She thought about what Azelvan had said. She thought, there is only one honest response to being recognized. To recognize back. She broadcast. She broadcast the state of being seen and choosing, in that moment of being seen, to look. To actually look. To direct the full weight of human attention, all of its history and capacity and accumulated hunger for the presence of other minds, outward, across 11 million kilometers, toward a 4-kilometer ship carrying a being she had never met, would not meet in any physical sense for years or decades to come, but had already, in the most meaningful way she knew, been in the same room with. She broadcast, I see you too.